Vala, night the 6th. So Urizen arose, and leaning on his spear, explored his dens. He threw his flight through the dark air to where a river flowed, and taking off his silver helmet, filled it and drank. But when unsatiated his thirst, he essayed to gather more. Lo, 3 terrific women at the verge of the bright flood, who would not suffer him to approach, but drove him back with storms. Urizen knew them not, and thus addressed the spirits of darkness. Who art thou, eldest woman, sitting in thy clouds? And what is that name written on thy forehead? What art thou? And wherefore dost thou pour this water forth in sighs and care? She answered not, but filled her urn and poured it forth abroad. Answerest thou not? Said Urizen. Then thou mayst answer me, thou terrible woman clad in blue, whose strong attractive power draws all into a fountain. At the rock of thy attraction, with frowning brow, thou sittest mistress of these mighty waters. She answered not, but stretched her arms and threw her limbs abroad. Or wilt thou answer, youngest woman, clad in shining green? With labor and care thou dost divide the current into 4. Queen of these dreadful rivers, speak, and let me hear thy voice. They reared up a wall of rocks, and Urizen raised his spear. They gave a scream. They knew their father. Urizen knew his daughters. They shrunk into their channels, dry the rocky strand beneath his feet, hiding themselves in rocky forms from the eyes of Urizen. Then Urizen wept, and thus his lamentation poured forth. A horrible and dreadful state. Those whom I loved best, on whom I poured the beauties of my light, adorning them with jewels and precious ornament labored with art divine, vests of the radiant colors of heaven, and crowns of golden fire. I gave sweet lilies to their breasts, and roses to their hair. I taught them songs of sweet delight. I gave their tender voices into the blue expanse, and I invented with laborious art sweet instruments of sound. In pride encompassing my knees, they poured their radiance above all. The daughters of Luva envied at their exceeding brightness, and the sons of eternity sent them gifts. Now I will pour my fury on them, and I will reverse the previous benediction. For the colors of loveliness I will give blackness, for jewels hoary frost, for ornament deformity, for crowns wreathed serpents, for sweet odors stinking corruptibility, for voices delight hoarse croakings inarticulate through frost, for labored fatherly care and sweet instruction I will give chains of dark ignorance, and cords of twisted self-conceit, and whips of stern repentance, and food of stubborn obstinacy, that they may curse Tharmas their god, and Los his adopted son, that they may curse and worship the obscure demon of destruction, that they may worship terrors and obey the violent. Go forth, sons of my curse, go forth, daughters of my abhorrence. And Tharmas heard the deadly scream across the watery world, and Urizen's loud-sounding voice lamenting on the wind, and he came riding in his fury. Froze to solid were his waters, silent in ridges he beheld them stand round Urizen, a dreary waste of solid waters. For the king of light darkened his brows with his cold helmet, and his gloomy spear darkened before him. Silent on the ridgy waves, he took his gloomy way before him. Tharmas fled, and flying fought, crying, What and who art thou, cold demon? Art thou Urizen? Art thou like me, risen again from death? Or art thou deathless? If thou art he, my desperate purpose hear, and give me death, for death to me is better far than life. Death my desire that I in vain in various paths have sought, but still I live. The body of man is given to me, I seek in vain to destroy, for still it surges forth in fish and monsters of the deeps, and in those monstrous forms I live in an eternal woe. And thou, Urizen, art fallen never to be delivered. Withhold thy light from me forever, and I will withhold from thee thy food. So shall we cease to be, and all our sorrows end, and the eternal man no more renew beneath our power. If thou refusest, in eternal flight thy beams in vain shall pursue Tharmas, and in vain shall crave for food. I will pour down my flight through dark immensity. Eternal falling, thou shalt pursue me, but in vain, till starved upon the void, thou hangest a dried skin, shrunk up, weak, wailing in the wind. So Tharmas spoke, but Urizen replied not. On his way he took, high bounding over hills and deserts, floods and horrible chasms. Infinite was his labor, without end his travel. He strove in vain, for hideous monsters of the deep annoyed him sore. Scaled and finned with iron and brass, they devoured the path before him. Incessant was the conflict. On he bent his weary steps, making a path toward the dark world of Urthona. He rose with pain upon the dreary mountains, and with pain descended, and he saw their grisly fears, and his eyes sickened at the sight. Howlings, gnashings, groanings, shriekings, shudderings, sobbings, burstings, mingled together to create a world for loss. In cruel delight loss brooded on the darkness, nor saw Urizen with a globe of fire lighting his dismal journey through the pathless world of death, writing in bitter tears and groans, in books of iron and brass, the enormous wonders of the abysses, once his brightest joy. For Urizen beheld the terrors of the abyss, wandering among the ruined spirits, once his children and the children of Luva, scared at the sound of their own sigh that seems to shake the immense. They wandered moping, in their heart a sun, a dreary moon, a universe of fiery constellations in their brain, an earth of wintry woe beneath their feet, and round their loins waters or winds or clouds or brooding lightnings and pestilential plagues. Beyond the bounds of their own self their senses cannot penetrate, as the tree knows not what is outside of its leaves and bark, and yet it drinks the summer joy and fears the winter sorrow. So in the regions of the grave none knows his dark compeer, though he partakes of his dire woes, and mutual returns the pang, the throb, the dolor, the convulsion in soul-sickening woes. The horrid shapes and sights of torment in burning dungeons and in fetters of red-hot iron, some with crowns of serpents, and some with monsters girding round their bosoms, some lying on beds of sulphur on racks and wheels. He beheld women marching over burning wastes of sand, in bands of hundreds and of fifties and of thousands, strucken with lightnings which blazed after them upon their shoulders in their march in successive volleys with loud thunders. Swift flew the King of Light over the burning deserts. Then the deserts passed, involved in clouds of smoke, with myriads moping in the stifling vapors. Swift flew the king, though flagged his powers, laboring till over rocks and mountains faint, weary. He wandered where multitudes were shut up in the solid mountains and in rocks which heaved with their torments. Then came he among fiery cities and castles burnt of burning steel. Then he beheld the forms of tigers and of lions, dishumanized men, many in serpents and in worms stretched out enormous length over the sullen mold, and slimy tracks obstruct his way, drawn out from deep to deep, woven by ribbed and scaled monsters, or armed in iron shell, or shell of brass or gold, a glistening torment shining and hissing in eternal pain. Some columns of fire or of water, sometimes stretched out in height, sometimes in length, sometimes in globing, wandering in vain, seeketh for ease. His voice to them was but an inarticulate thunder, for their ears were heavy and dull, and their eyes and nostrils closed up. Oft he stood by a howling victim, questioning in words soothing or furious. No one answered. Everyone wrapped up in his own sorrow howled regardless of his words, nor voice of sweet response could he obtain, though oft essayed with tears. He knew they were his children, ruined in his ruined world. Oft would he stand and question a fierce scorpion glowing with gold. In vain. The terror heard not. Then a lion he would seize by the fierce mane, staying his howling course. In vain the voice of Urizen, in vain the eloquent tongue. Rock, cloud, a mountain were not vocal as in climes of happy eternity, where the lamb replies to the infant voice, and the lion to the man of years giving them sweet instructions, where the cloud, the river, and the field talk with the husbandman and shepherd. But these attacked him sore, seizing upon his feet and rending the sinews. Then caves he hid, to recure his obstructed powers with rest and oblivion. Here he had time enough to repent of his rashly threatened curse. He saw them cursed beyond his curse. His soul melted with fear. He could not take their fetters off, for they grew from the soul, nor could he quench the fires, for they flamed out from the heart. Nor could he calm the elements, because himself was subject, and so he threw his flight in terror and pain, and in repentant tears. When he had passed these southern terrors, he approached the east, void, pathless, beaten with iron sleet and eternal hail and rain. No living form was there, no living thing, and yet his way lay through this dismal world. He stood a while and looked back over his former terrific voyage, hills and vales of torment and despair. Sighing and wiping a fresh tear, then turning round, he threw himself into the dismal void. Falling, he fell and fell, whirling in irresistible revolutions, down and down in the horrid bottomless vacuity. Falling into the eastern vacuity, the empty world of Luva. The ever-pitying one who seeth all things saw his fall, and in the dark vacuity created a bosom of clay. When weary, dead he fell, his limbs reposed in the bosom of slime. As the seed falls from the sower's hand, so Urizen fell, and death shut up his powers in oblivion. Then, as the seed shoots forth in pain and sorrow, so the slimy bed his limbs renewed. First in infant weakness. Periods past, he gathered strength, but still in solitude he sat. Then rising through his flight onward, though falling through the waste of night, and ending in death, and in another resurrection to sorrow and weary travel. But still his books he bore in his strong hands, and his iron pen. For when he died, they lay beside his grave, and when he rose, he seized them with a gloomy smile. For wrapped in his death clothes, he hid them when he slept in death. When he revived, the clothes were rotted by the winds. The books remained, still unconsumed, still to be written and interleaved with brass and iron and gold, time after time. For such a journey none but iron pens can write, and adamantine leaves receive. Nor can the man who goes the journey obstinate refuse to write, time after time. Endless had been his travel, but the divine hand him led. For infinite the distance, and obscured in combustions dire, by rocky masses frowning in the abysses, revolving erratic round lakes of fire, in the dark deep the ruins of Urizen's world. Oft would he sit in a dark rift and regulate his books, or sleep such sleep as spirits eternal, wearied in his dark, tearful, and sorrowful state. Then rise, look out and ponder his dismal voyage, eyeing the next sphere, though far remote. Then darting into the abyss of night, his venturous limbs, through lightnings, thunders, earthquakes, and concussions, fires and floods, stemming his downward fall, laboring up against futurity, creating many a vortex, fixing many a science in the deep, and thence throwing his venturous limbs into the vast unknown, swift from chaos to chaos, from void to void, a road immense. For when he came to where a vortex ceased to operate, nor down nor up remained, then if he turned and looked back from whence he came, 'twas upward all. And if he turned and viewed the unpassed void, upward was still his mighty wandering, the midst between, an equilibrium gray of air serene, where he might live in peace, and where his life might meet repose. But Urizen said, "Can I not leave this world of cumbrous wheels, circle o'er circle, nor on high attain a void where self-sustaining I may view all things beneath my feet, or sinking through these elemental wonders, swift to fall. I thought perhaps to find an end, a world beneath the voidness, whence I might travel round the outside of this dark confusion. When I bend downward, bending my head downward into the deep, 'tis upward all, which way soe'er I my course begin. But when a vortex formed on high by labor and sorrow and care and weariness begins on all my limbs, then sleep revives my wearied spirits, waking them till downward all which way soe'er I my spirits turn, no end I find of all. Oh, what a world here, unlike those climes of bliss where my sons gather round my knees. Oh, thou poor ruined world, thou horrible ruin, once like me thou wast all glorious, now like me partaking desolate thy master's lot. Art thou, O ruin, the once glorious heaven, were these thy rocks, where joy sang in the trees, and pleasure sported on the rivers, and laughter sat beneath the oaks, and innocence sported round upon the green plains, and sweet friendship met in palaces, and books and instruments of song and pictures of delight. Where are they, whelmed beneath these ruins in horrible destruction? And if eternal falling I repose on the dark bosom of winds and waters, or thence fall into a void where air is not, falling through immensity ever and ever, I lose my powers, weakened every revolution till a death shuts my powers. Then a seed in the vast womb of darkness I dwell in oblivion. Brooding over me, the enormous worlds reorganize me, shooting forth in bones and flesh and blood. I am regenerated to fall, or rise at will, or to remain a laborer of ages, a dire discontent, a living woe wandering in vain. Here will I fix my foot, and here rebuild. Here mountains of brass promise much riches in their dreadful bosoms. So he began to dig, forming of gold, silver, and iron and brass vast instruments to measure out the immense, and fix the whole into another world better suited to obey his will, where none should dare oppose his will, himself being king of all, in all futurity be bound in his vast chain. And the sciences were fixed, and the vortexes began to operate on all the sons of men, and every human soul, terrified at the turning wheels of heaven, shrunk away, inward withering away, gaining a new dominion over all his sons and daughters, and over the sons and daughters of Luva in the horrible abyss. For Urizen lamented over them in a selfish lamentation, till a white woof covered his cold limbs from head to feet. Hair white as snow covered him, and flaky locks terrific overspreading his limbs. In pride he wandered, weeping, clothed in aged venerableness, obstinately resolved, traveling through darkness, and wherever he traveled a dire web followed him, as the web of a spider, dusky and cold, shivering across from vortex to vortex, drawn out from his mantle of years, a living mantle, joined to his life, and growing from his soul. And the web of Urizen stretched direful, shivering in clouds, in uttering such woes, such bursts, such thunderings. The eyelids expanse of his mourning, and the ears there is a golden ascent winding round to the heaven of heavens, within the dark horrors of the abyss, lion or tiger or scorpion. For every one opened within into eternity at will, but they were fused, because their outward forms were in the abyss. In the wing-like tent of the universe, beautiful, surrounding all, or drawn up or let down at the will of the immortal man, vibrated in such anguish the eyeballs quivered. Weaker and weaker their expansive orbs began shrinking. Pangs smote through the brain, and a universal shriek ran through the abysses, rending the web, torment on torment. Thus Urizen in sorrows wandered many a dreary way, warring with monsters of the deeps in his most hideous pilgrimage, till his bright hair scattered in snows, his skin barked o'er with wrinkles, 4 caverns rooting downwards, their foundations thrusting forth, the metal, rock, and stone in ever painful throes of vegetation. The cave of Orcs stood to the south, a furnace of dire flames, quenchless, unceasing. In the west, the cave of Urizen. For Urizen fell as the midday sun falls down into the west. North stood Urthona's steadfast throne, a world of solid darkness, shut up in stifling obstruction, rooted in dumb despair. The east was void. But Tharmas rolled his billows in ceaseless eddies, void, pathless, beat with snows eternal and iron hail and rain, all through the caverns of fire and air and earth, seeking for Enion's limbs, not finding but the black seaweed and sickening slime, flying away from Urizen that he might not give him food, above, beneath, on all sides round in the vast deep of immensity, that he might starve the sons and daughters of Urizen on the winds, making between horrible chasms into the vast unknown. All these around the world of loss cast forth their monstrous births, but in eternal times the seat of Urizen is in the south, Urthona in the north, Luva in east, Tharmas in west. Now he came into the abhorred world of dark Urthona by providence divine conducted, nor bent from his own will, lest death eternal should be the result, for will cannot be violated. Into the doleful vales where no tree grew, nor river flowed, nor man, nor beast, nor creeping thing, nor sun, nor cloud, nor star. Still he with his globe of fire immense in his venturous hand bore on through the affrighted vales, ascending and descending, o'er-wearied. In cumbrous flight he ventured o'er dark rifts, or down dark precipices, or climbed with pain and labor huge, till he beheld the world of loss from the peaked rock of Urthona, and heard the howling of red orc, distincter and distincter. Redoubling his immortal efforts through the narrow vales with difficulty down descending, guided by his ear and by his globe of fire, he went down the vale of Urthona between the enormous iron walls built by the spectre dark. Dark grew his globe, reddening with mist, and full before his path, striding across the narrow vale, the shadow of Urthona, of spectre vast, appeared, whose feet and legs with iron scaled stamped the hard rocks, expectant of the unknown wanderer, whom he had seen wandering his nether world when distant far, and watched his swift approach. Collected dark the spectre stood. Beside him Tharmas stayed his flight and stood in stern defiance, communing with the spectre who rejoiced along the vale. Round his loins a girdle glowed with many-colored fires. In his hand a knotted club whose knots like mountains frowned, desert among the stars, them withering with its ridges cold. Black scales of iron arm the dread visage. Iron spikes instead of hair shoot from his orbed skull. His glowing eyes burn like two furnaces. He called with voice of thunder. 4 winged heralds mount the furious blasts and blow their trumps, gold, silver, brass, and iron. Clangers clamoring rend the shores like white clouds rising from the vales. His 52 armies from the 4 cliffs of Urthona rise glowing around the spectre. 4 sons of Urizen, the squadrons of Urthona led in arms, of gold and silver, brass and iron. He knew his mighty sons. Then Urizen arose upon the wind, back many a mile retiring into his dire web, scattering fleecy snows as he ascended, howling loud. The web vibrated strong from heaven to heaven, from globe to globe. In vast eccentric paths compulsive rolled the comets at his dread command, the dreary way falling with wheel impetuous down among Urthona's vales, and round red orc returning back to Urizen gorged with blood. Slow roll the massy globes at his command, and slow o'erwheel the dismal squadrons of Urthona, weaving the dire web in their progressions and preparing Urizen's path before him. End of the 6th night.